India, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan. There is hardly any country in China's neighborhood that China has not had a territorial dispute with. And as if that were not enough, of late, China has also started eyeing the South China Sea to stake its claim on this water body. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at some of the territorial disputes of China, their origins, the history, and the possible reasons for China staking a claim on these regions. China's territorial dispute with India is covered in episode 45, and its territorial dispute with Taiwan is covered in episode 46. So we start this episode with the South China Sea dispute. The South China Sea is dotted with small islands, reefs, and shoals, and is a crucial global shipping route. China claims that it owns almost all of the 1.3 million square miles of the South China Sea, but 6 other governments in the neighborhood challenge that claim. And these governments are the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Taiwan. And the origins of this controversy can be found in around 1947, when a Chinese geographer, Yang Huiren, etched a U-shaped 11-line on Chinese maps to demarcate roughly 90% of the South China Sea for China. Wait, what is the 11-line? Well, in 1947, 11 dashes were drawn on the map of the South China Sea along the coasts of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Taiwan to indicate the boundary that China claimed to be its own within the South China Sea. So 11 lines starting with the Gulf of Tonkin along the border of China, going down along the shoreline of Vietnam, then coming up to form a U along Malaysia, then the shoreline of Indonesia, Philippines, and Taiwan to form the 11-line. And at that time, the Premier Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang government was looking to identify some of its maritime treasures in order to consolidate its power within mainland China. But within 2 years, the Kuomintang government was overthrown by the communists in the Civil War, and geographer Yang Huiren was persecuted as an anti-revolutionary academic authority, and the entire map of the South China Sea, along with the 11 dashes, were relegated to the background. And then, in 1952, Chairman Mao Zedong, through his premier Zhou Enlai, decided to hand over the Gulf of Tonkin to Vietnam. This was more as a symbol of friendship between two communist nations. But in doing so, without their knowledge, the Chinese government dropped 2 dashes from the 11-line. So now it was the Nine-DashLine. Many historians are bewildered as to why China would willingly give up some of this sea territory, especially when it fought a war 10 years later with India over a small border tiff. The answer lies more in the mindset. Historically, China did not pay much attention to the oceans. So outside of some seafaring exploration during the Ming Dynasty, that was between 1368 and 1644, China's emperors mainly shut their empire off from the seas. And it is because of this that there is very little cartographic proof of China's claims to the South China Sea. During the Qing Dynasty, which replaced the Ming Dynasty and lasted till 1911, there weren't many good maps maintained, and the Qing Dynasty actually showed the South China Sea as a small lake. For several decades after 1952, not much was talked about the Nine-DashLine. But then in 2009, Vietnam submitted a claim over sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratly Islands. And these are not too far from the Gulf of Tonkin. Yeah, the same Gulf of Tonkin that was gifted to Vietnam by China. And China immediately countered the claim by submitting a map to the UN with the 9-dash-lines. And China claimed that it had indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and it enjoyed sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, the seabed, and the subsoil. Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines immediately objected, and they asserted that, among other things, China's claim was without basis under the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. What is that? It is an international agreement that establishes a legal framework for all marine and maritime activities. The UNCLOS replaces the older freedom of the seas concept dating from the 17th century, which specified that national rights were limited to a specific belt of water extending from a nation's coastline, usually up to 3 nautical miles or about 5.6 kilometers. All waters beyond this belt were considered international waters, free to all nations but belonging to none of them. In the early 20th century, the freedom of the seas concept was challenged by some nations who expressed their desire to extend national claims to include mineral resources and to protect fish stocks. So in 1956, the United Nations held its first conference on the law of the sea at Geneva, Switzerland. And by UNCLOS III, which was held in 1973 in New York, several treaties with respect to territorial rights across seas and oceans were passed. From a territorial waters perspective, the sea was divided into 3 zones: the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, and the exclusive economic zone. The territorial sea extended up to 12 nautical miles or 22 kilometers from the baseline, and here the coastal state had full sovereign rights and jurisdiction across this area of the sea. So the state could set laws, regulate the use, and use any resource. Beyond this 12 nautical zone was the contiguous zone, which was extended to another 12 nautical miles, and here the state had sovereignty only in specific areas related to customs, taxation, immigration, and pollution. And beyond the contiguous zone was the exclusive economic zone, which extended up to 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers. And within this area, the coastal nation had sole exploitation rights over all natural resources. And with respect to the natural resources, the core areas of contention were offshore oil drilling and fishing rights. And when it comes to the South China Sea, experts believe that under the seabed lies as much as 130 billion barrels of oil and 900 trillion cubic feet of gas. And that exactly is the source of contention between China and its neighbors. And then in 2014, China decided to kind of find a lasting solution to this problem by converting some of the reefs and sandbars in the middle of the South China Sea into man-made artificial islands. And these artificial islands were then fortified with missiles, runways, and weapon systems, which in the end prompted a huge outcry from the neighboring governments. And then on July 12, 2016, an international UN tribunal ruled that the 9-dash demarcation line could not be used by Beijing to make historical claims to the South China Sea. Under UNCLOS, artificial islands don't have any maritime rights and nor do any submerged reefs. And the panel concluded that Beijing's activities within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, such as illegal fishing and environmentally ruinous activity related to construction of the artificial islands, infringed on Manila's sovereign rights. So based on the UNCLOS treaty, the tribunal correctly concluded that that specific region was within Philippines' exclusive economic zone, and China was infringing upon it. China reacted with outrage to the judgment, but it is a signatory of the UNCLOS treaty, so this judgment is binding upon it. So where does the dispute stand today? Since the ruling of the tribunal, China increased its military activity in the South China Sea by conducting a series of naval maneuvers and exercises in April and March of 2018. But since then, the tensions between Philippines, Vietnam, and China have cooled down. But the United States has also stepped up its military activity and naval presence and called for closer partnership with India in the South China Sea as part of the Quad Alliance. And I talked about it briefly in episode 59. The Philippines, though, is continuing to mount pressure on China to accept the 2016 Hague ruling, which rejected China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. Moving northeast from the South China Sea to the East China Sea is a region between Taiwan and Japan, which has the Senkaku Islands, which are located about 1,200 miles or 1,900 kilometers southwest of Tokyo. And both China and Japan have claimed this rocky, uninhabited island chain as their own. The interesting twist here being that Taiwan, too, claims these islands as its own. Both China and Taiwan claim that these set of islands were used as a staging point for Chinese fishermen from the 1400s. But from Japan's point of view, the islands were incorporated into Japanese territory in 1895, after the government says they carefully ascertained that there was no trace of control over the Senkaku Islands by another state prior to 1895. And at one point, about 200 Japanese people lived on the islands, and China did not challenge Japanese sovereignty over the islands for 75 years, starting 1895. But all this changed in the 1970s when it was determined that the area around these islands, that is in the East China Sea, could have significant oil reserves. Yes, same source of contention as in the South China Sea. Another interesting factor in this dispute is that when we look at it from the UNCLOS definition of the exclusive economic zone, that is the 200 nautical mile boundary from the coast, these set of islands overlap the exclusive economic zones of both China and Japan. And that is because in the East China Sea, the distance from the coast of mainland China to the coast of Japan is less than 400 nautical miles. And in such an event of overlapping exclusive economic zones or EEZs, UNCLOS Articles 74 and 83 task the parties to the dispute with defining the boundary between their claimed maritime zones by mutual agreement. In other words, China and Japan are expected to settle this dispute between each other amicably through an agreement. However, since 2016, the Chinese Coast Guard ships have been consistently entering Japanese territorial waters around the Senkaku Island chain. And every time, the Japanese Coast Guard ships have had to deliver warnings to the Chinese ships to leave. So it is going to be anybody's guess as to when the two parties will drop the cat and mouse game and come to the negotiating table to resolve this dispute. And that takes us to the Himalayan region of China, India, and Bhutan. And on June 8, 2017, a platoon-sized unit of China border guards moved into Doklam, a territory claimed by both China and Bhutan. They destroyed stone bunkers used by the Royal Bhutan Army, and shortly afterward, a Chinese road construction crew arrived with excavators, bulldozers, and a military escort. 8 days later, on June 16, Indian troops arrived and blocked the road building effort. The next 2 months saw periodic scuffles at Doklam between the Chinese and the Indian military units. It was not till August 28th that both nations agreed to what India termed as an expeditious disengagement of forces in the region. There were two factors that led to India's response in Doklam. The first one being New Delhi is a security guarantor for Bhutan. Under the 1949 Treaty of Friendship between India and Bhutan, Bhutan is to be guided by the advice of the government of India in regard to its external relations. The treaty was revised in 2007 to commit both governments to cooperate closely with each other on issues related to their national interests. So China unilaterally trying to build a road without India's approval was going basically against the tenet of that agreement. Or maybe China was trying to throw its weight in the region and negate India's importance to Bhutan. The second, more strategic factor was that Doklam is very close to the Siliguri corridor, which is a 17-mile wide strip of land which connects the northeastern part of India to the rest of the country. I talked about this briefly in episode 45, but basically, India considered the construction of a road infrastructure in Doklam a potential threat to the Siliguri corridor. Now, India and China have had several border skirmishes through the years, and many observers believe that the Doklam incident too may have been one of them. But it is more likely that there was a deeper strategic thought behind this face-off at Doklam. China is already trying to negotiate a boundary resolution with Bhutan. And the areas it disputes with Bhutan are Doklam on Bhutan's west and Kulakangri and Beiyul on Bhutan's northeastern side. Knowing that India would have had an issue with Doklam, it is possible that it was thinking of getting a concession out of India that would allow Bhutan to cede Kulakangri and Beiyul to China in exchange for keeping Doklam with Bhutan. Not sure if this assessment is accurate, but it is a possibility. But one thing to note here is that all these regions, be it Doklam, Kulakangri, or Beiyul, are not truly China-Bhutan boundaries, but more like Tibet-Bhutan boundaries. And China, over the years, has been trying to upgrade the infrastructure along the Tibetan border to make sure that it has full access into Tibetan territory. And it is probably because of these frequent skirmishes along the border with China that India ended up becoming a member of the Quad ahead of the Philippines. So be it the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or the border with Bhutan, China is increasingly asserting itself in that region. And it is for that reason that the United States has started showing a lot more participation and interest in that region through the creation of the regional group called Quad and reaching out more to other governments in that region who consider China a common enemy. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What was the first soft landing on another planet conducted by humans? In December of 1970, the Soviet Union successfully landed the Venera 7 spacecraft on Venus, making it the first soft landing on another planet. So the answer is D, the Venera 7 landing on Venus by the Soviet Union. Question for the current episode. So far, 168 countries have signed the UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The question is, which of the following countries has not yet signed the UNCLOS? Is it A, Egypt, B, India, C, the United States, or D, Mexico? Once again, which of the following countries has not yet signed the UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? Is it A, Egypt, B, India, C, the United States, or D, Mexico? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at some of the major political scandals in the United States history. You will be surprised at the depth of corruption in the corridors of power. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.